Hello HEMA friends and welcome to this new video. Today we're going to compare the Saber and the arming sword in relation to their grip. So the grip which is applied to use such kind of weapons. And we are going to understand why certain weapons evolved in a certain direction or actually were designed in a certain direction, even in the same time period sometimes, depending from the use of such kind of tool. Now let's start from the Saber. And we can call, of course, the Saber Saber grip actually. So the Saber grip basically uses the thumb, so you extend the thumb over the flat surface of the Saber grip to put opposition between your thumb and your pinky and ring finger. Now, this kind of grip makes you able to extend the weapon far more and to use in a far better way with only one hand the wrist mobility to extend your weapon and pull it back. Now, this kind of motion is far easier while using a weapon in this kind of way. So while gripping the weapon in this kind of way with the thumb extended over the top of the handle. It simply makes you able to use the wrist in a better way because the extension of the wrist works better, simply. Now, if we compare it with the arming sword, we will notice that the arming sword, generally speaking, has a grip which is slightly different, which is rounded, a little bit rounded on average, on the top and the bottom, let's say, of the grip itself, so on the thinner part. And generally speaking, also on the more larger part, sometimes is a little bit more rounded. Now, this makes for a grip which is slightly different. Now, the leverage in this case is granted by the pinky and the ring finger, which are opposing this time the thumb and the index finger, which are pinching the sword together and granting this kind of opposition between the two parts, which creates the leverage and makes you able to move the sword around. Having your index knuckle on top of the handle, which generally happens in this case, also grant a little bit more of leverage and also a better grip, basically. So this kind of way of handling the sword, as you may see, is more complex. But also being more complex to apply the leverage makes you, funny enough, more free. Because the weapon is lesser optimized, let's say the handle is lesser optimized for a certain kind of grip, which makes you able to rotate the weapon around more easily simply by opening up your hand, which requires a certain level of skill, of course, but not as much as we will see if compared to trying to rotate around the Saber, which has a more, let's call it, developed in a certain kind of way, kind of grip, which is suited to make you able to use the weapon in a certain kind of way. Namely, it is easier to do a lot of motions in front of your body, but it is slightly harder to use your elbow for certain motions because you have to, let's say, handle your grip in a certain specific way if you want to obtain the same result which I was obtaining with my arming sword a minute ago. This is because, of course, of the way in which you have to keep the weapon in your hand, which requires you to keep the thumb positioned in a way which makes slightly harder to land certain motions. Of course, harder if you are not used to it. It's not very hard, but it is slightly harder compared to the arming sword, for instance, which give you more degree of freedom in moving the weapon around. At the same time, while using the arming sword, this kind of motion here, it's basically of no use, or almost, basically. So the arming sword is more optimized to use your elbow as the main way to propel the sword around in general. Elbow and the shoulder, of course. So it is a weapon which is designed to strike harder on average because it had a slightly different use, let's say. the dueling saber or the military saber are a kind of a side-to-side weapon, or are specific tools made for specific activities, such as dueling. And they need to be fast, they need to cover you very well in front of you, they need to be able to land snipey cuts sometimes, especially if you are dueling, and the first blood especially. So they are a very specific kind of weapon, and because of this, developed in that kind of direction. Now, the arming sword in general is a multi-tool, sometimes we can define it, and it had been useful for war, for self-defense, for dueling also. Maybe sometimes they developed certain swords, of course, for certain activities. They improved a certain sword for some kind of motivation, to being able to go against certain kind of armor sometimes, or to defeat other kind of weapons, etc., etc. But on average, the arming sword is more a multi-tool, multi-purpose, it is better, it is correct, multi-purpose kind of weapon, which gives you more degree of freedom, but at the same time it is not optimized for anything in the specific. Now with the saber, of course, it is the opposite. The saber is very optimized, as I mentioned, and thus the grip is optimized in this kind of direction. Now this grip is not only typical of the saber, actually. We can find it on the messer, for instance. And the messer is far from being a optimized weapon for certain kind of things. It is actually a different tool, and it is still a multi-purpose tool, actually, which spread out in various environments and in various parts of the medieval society, but at the same time it shows a grip which is similar to the one of the saber. Now, why this kind of thing, actually? Well, simply because the messer is actually a knife, and the knife shows a knife grip, actually. If you look, generally speaking, at your average kitchen knife also, you will notice that it makes you able to grip the knife in different ways, and one is, funny enough, the saber grip. So you can put the thumb on top of the upper part of the knife. And one of the peculiarity of the messer, but not of all messers, because again you can find a variety of shapes of messers which are more sword-like also in the grip, but on average you will spot a knife grip on the messer, which is very similar to the one of the saber. Now, on the messer, which unluckily I don't have here with me, you have basically a kind of hybrid condition, namely that while using the messer, you can use the messer as a sword, basically, gripping it in the way which I just shown you for the arming sword, or gripping it as the saber. And you can even transition from one position to the other. This last sentence of transitioning from one grip to the other is true for most weapons, actually. But the one which are more developed in one direction and are more, let's say, complex in the making, such as the saber, doesn't make for an easy transition, or better, transitioning too much away from the grip makes you unable sometimes to deliver a correct attack. While weapons which are, let's say, lesser refined in the making and more simple, that give you more degrees of freedom, such as the messer, for instance, make you able to transition from one grip to the other a little bit more easily. But on average, even if I am a great advocate for transitioning between one grip and the other, transitioning between the handshake grip and the saber grip is not that easy, especially if you have a handle which is not meant for that kind of grip. For instance, on the arming sword, reaching this kind of position at the end of a cut is definitely possible. You can just propel the weapon forward and let it go and stop it by the pommel here, but it's far more complex than just cutting at an angle, keeping your weapon gripped in a more tight way, so pinching the weapon, as I mentioned, between index and thumb. And so these last options becomes a little bit more prominent while handling your sword around, because it simply is easier to apply. You don't risk to lose the edge alignment while landing certain blows and rotating your sword around. So, long story short, we can define a number of criteria for why certain weapons are designed in a certain kind of way, talking about the grip compared to others. Now, one is, of course, its use. Should the weapon be able to land a snipey, tiny little cut propelled only with the wrist, basically? One of the motivations is this one. Is instead the weapon made to work mainly with elbow and shoulder, then a certain kind of grip is not necessary, or maybe even not the best one, such as in the case of the arming sword. The second criteria actually is related to, is the weapon a weapon per se or not? So is the weapon actually created to just being a weapon in the first place or not? Such as in the case of the messer. The messer is not a weapon per se, it is a knife that happens to develop in certain conditions and for certain motivations into a weapon. And the greatest majority of the times keeps its peculiarities as a knife, funny enough. And the third criteria are the various contexts of application of a weapon, which the greatest majority of the time, even if not always, because we are human and we make errors, are considered in the making of a weapon. If the weapon is made for a specific purpose, then the weapon develops for that specific kind of purpose. It is a specialist kind of weapon. Instead, if the weapon is designed to be able to deal with a variety of contexts of application, such as war, self-defense, dueling, all together, then it develops in a more vague way, let's say. It is less specialized, which makes it less good at dealing with all the various specific jobs, but at the same time very handy in the greatest variety of contexts. Very good, so we learned why certain grips were made, certain handles were made in a certain way, and why certain grips are required to use that weapons in a specific way. I hope you will find this video useful. Thanks for watching as always. Remember to check my Patreon, link in the description if you want to know more about my work and if you want to see more of my content. Thanks for watching as always, and see you next time.